Good afternoon. This is Jane Silveria with the Department of Education, and I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon as we talk about what's new with TABE 11 and 12. I want you to know that this presentation is being recorded and will be archived on the IPDAY site for people to come back and look at a later date. As the audience, you're in a listen-only mode. There is a question and answer box, QA box, and you can type in your questions and I will get to them as I can, or I definitely will answer them all at the end of my presentation. Okay, the first thing I'd like to start is with a little bit of a preview of what you can expect here in the future. The first thing we're looking at that is slated for late July or early August will be a TABE refresher webinar training. This will be for people that are already certified in TABE 9 and 10 and need to be certified in 11 and 12. You will be able to print out a certificate. You will have to be able to provide proof that you are already certified in order to do this. The next will be a TABE certification training. That is slated for late September. We're looking at this as a two-part training, one part being Data Recognition Corporation's testing policies, and the other part of that being the Florida state policies that go along with testing. So we're looking at a two-part training with that being out on IPDAY. The next thing will be how to interpret TABE for teachers. This will be a web training on the IPDAY website that will allow teachers to go through and look at the way the test reports are laid out and how to use that information to drive instruction. The last thing here is preparing for TABE, and that's a student document similar to the document that we have on the web now for TABE 9 and 10, but looking at expanding that to include some information from their online tutorial, how to use the tools that are available online if they're taking the test that way. Another thing that we'll be doing that is not on my preview sheet here will be a post-testing guideline chart similar to what we have for TABE 9 and 10, so that if you pre-test it in one test, you can look at the scale score and note when you need to move up to the next level of test. Someone's asking if we can get a copy of the PowerPoint. That will be available on IPDAY as soon as we're done with the presentation. You'll be able to download that. I want to bring attention to two sites that are relevant to TABE. The first site is tabetest.com. This is an open site. You do not need a password or any identification or anything like that. Anyone can go into this site. There at that site, you will see practice items. There are sample questions to the TABE 11 and 12 on EM, DNA for all three of the sub-skill areas, math, language, and reading. So you can go out and look at those practice items. You can use them in whatever way you see fit. Just remember that it is copyrighted material. The next thing you'll see out there will be the blueprints. This breaks the test down into each of the test levels and the sub skills, and shows you the breakdown of what types of college and career readiness standards are on each of those tests, along with the emphasis of those standards on the test. Then you have a scale score, and what that is a crosswalk between the minimum scale scores to the solid grade equivalents, such as a ninth grade level would be a 575 or 576. The next thing is a quick start guide that can take you through all of the information of how to set up a test session, how to add students to that test session, how to add new testers, how to print reports. You can also have the order form, so you can go in there and purchase your online or your paper-based versions. There's a sample individual profile report, so you can look at what the test results look like with 11 and 12. And then there's online training videos included there. The other site is drcdirect.com. It's drcedirect.com. And you have access to this if you currently have online testing. You may have to have different abilities turned on for you to access the things I'm talking about. But if you have a sign-in, then your administrator can add you on to that. You can find the test directions there, so that if you're giving the paper-based test or even the online test and you're looking at what instructions have to be read, you'll be able to find those. They're also there for the Locator test. Then you have a scoring guide or a scoring table. This replaces the norm table, the norms booklet. It lists table 11 and 12 side by side with the number correct, the scale score, the standard error measure, and the national reporting system level. It also breaks down each test into the domains and lets you know the proficiency on each domain. There's also the technical report in case you want to find out more about the test and how it was developed, how the item response theory was done, or anything like that. You can find that in the technical report. The last thing out there that you need to be familiar with is the Test Administrator Manual. This manual gives you all the guidelines for the standardized tests that you're administering. So you need to be familiar with that manual. So let's talk a little bit about TABE 9 and 10 before we put it to rest. We will put it to rest on December the 31st of 2018. The National Reporting System has approved this test through February or March of 2019, but as a state, we felt it was better to end this test at the end of a reporting semester. So what our recommendation is that if you have students, continuing students, that have already tested in 9-10, you will continue to test them in 9-10 until either they reach the ASE level, the GED prep, or they move, or we hit 1231. If we hit the end of December and they have not moved on to GED prep, when you come back in January, that student will need to be given the Locator test and retest it to find out what level they're functioning at. The student will not be moved backwards into a lower level than they're already in. Instruction will continue at the level they were placed in prior to retesting. And then you will test after 50 to 60 hours of instruction and move on accordingly. All 9 and 10 booklets must be shredded after expiration. You cannot keep them around and use them for study guides or practice tests or anything like that. And career technical education can also use this test up until 1231. If you have career technical students that have passed part of this test, have reached the minimum basic skills level on 9 and 10 for one or two of the subject areas and are still lacking on some of the other subject areas, they will only need to be retested on those areas that they did not meet the basic skills in, and that would be on 11 and 12 after January. So TABE 11 and 12, it is written to new standards. It is written with the National College and Career Readiness Standards, the NCCR. And there's 2 websites here so that you can look at those. The second website is Department of Education here in Florida's Career Adult Frameworks. And you can see how those CCRs are correlated to the frameworks. The test only has one length. There is no more survey and complete battery. There is one test. The test has an allowable time of up to 5 hours. In field testing and in the few sites that are already using this test in Florida, we have found that it's taking somewhere between 3 and 3.5 hours for the majority of students to complete the test. The new test only has one math test. There are two parts to the one math test, but there are no computation type questions. The focus is on applied math. There's an improved locator design. It is a longer locator and it provides a stronger placement into the proper TABE level for testing. There are only 3 tests. There are reading, math, and language tests only. There are no longer science and social studies or language mechanics, vocabulary, and spelling. There are no total battery scores. You are given 3 individual subtest scores, one for reading, one for math, and one for language. There's no PC version. They will not be giving you the test on a disk that you can load onto your computer and take to off-site areas. There is paper-based and online versions only at this time. There is a standalone online version where the administrator's computer must be hooked to the internet and the other computers that the students would be testing on are hooked to the administrator computer and not to the internet. They're also working on an offline, online version that they hope to be ready in about 6 months. This test is aligned to all 3 of the national high school equivalency exams that are offered throughout the state because it is aligned to the college and career readiness standards. So if you've been using the adult ed frameworks that are already correlated to the CCR, this should be a pretty smooth transition for those students. And there are no grade equivalents on this new test. There are scale scores only. We have provided a matrix to correlate the minimum scale score levels to the solid grade equivalent levels used in career and technical education. So we have them on this website from the 8th through the 12th grade. They did away with the word mastery. They felt that if we had students that were answering maybe 1 or 2 questions in a sub-skill area, that didn't really show mastery. It shows proficiency. So you will now see partial proficiency, proficiency, and non-proficiency. The questions and answers are based on response theory. So not all questions are equal point value. And not all items on the test are scored. There are some items that they have placed on the test to field test them for use in future tests, either it be adaptive or another version of the test. The information provided on the individual profile is provided on objectives. You'll see the domain and the sub-skill areas so that you teach to the skill area and not to the specific question on the test. I mentioned that the time is allowable. That means they have up till that amount of time, even though they may finish in less time. There's no more TestMate TABE and the Scantron for scoring. All the scoring will be done by Data Recognition Corporation. If you're testing online, it will continue the way it has been done. If you're testing by paper-based, when you buy your paper-based test, DRC will provide you with credentials so that you can log on to the DRC portal. What you will need is a dual read, continuous feed, Twain compliant scanner to scan the answer document and send it to DRC for scoring. It will be returned to you through the DRC portal so that if you're testing online and paper-based, they'll be able to be combined for all of your reporting purposes. They will not be providing a stencil overlay. You may create your own. They will have the scorees answer sheets available. They're with the printer at this time. And like I said earlier, there's a scoring guide that replaces the NARMS booklet. This test is approved by the National Reporting System for 7 years, so it's approved through September of 2014. This is your content difficulty level for mathematics. Like I said before, mathematics has a two-part test. You have part 1 and part 2. The content difficulty ranges are literacy, kindergarten, first grade, easy, second, third, medium, 4th through 6th, difficult, 6 through 8, and advanced, 9 through 12. This math test overlaps the 6th grade on both the M and the D level of the test. The math test has 40 questions, 40 items, for an allowable time of 75 minutes. The reading test also has 2 parts. The language only has 1. The content difficulty levels are the same as in math, except the 6th grade does not overlap. The M level is 4th and 5th grade, and the D level is 6 through 8. The reading 2-part test has 47 items at 120 minutes for levels L through M and 130 minutes for levels D and A. The language has 40 items with an allowable time of 85 minutes. Everyone has complained about the length of this test, so the publisher has proposed, and notice that this is proposed, changes to the testing times. Because this test is approved by the National Reporting System, any changes that are done must also be approved. This was submitted to the NRS about 2 months ago, and we are still waiting to hear of the approval. It will shorten the reading test to 120 minutes, 60 minutes for each part. It will shorten the language test from 85 minutes to 70 to 60 minutes, and it will shorten the math test from 75 minutes down to 70 minutes. The locator will go from 105 to 95. So we've got a little bit shorter allowable times. Excuse me. There's some standardized procedures that go along with this test. The first one is they want a minimum of 1 examiner for every 20 examinees, so that the test is proctored with the appropriate number of administrators. They want you to verify IDs. They want you only to make sure that only authorized materials are allowed in the testing room, that no cell phones or other electronic devices are allowed, that your 2-part test, your reading and your mathematics, are administered in sequence. We've had some questions about sequence, and mainly when it comes to the fact that you may be meeting for 1 hour at a time, and you may not meet again until the next class period, so Monday and Wednesday. This can be considered sequence. The main thing to remember when you're administering the 2-part test is that both parts must be completed before either can be scored. The part 1 and part 2 are on the same answer sheet together, so they have to be submitted at once. Other standardized procedures are that all scrap paper must be collected and destroyed, that you must collect and shred all of your test tickets for the online testing, that you collect any pencils and scrap paper, that you collect calculators and erase the memory from those calculators so it's not available for the next student, that you have a sign-in sheet for all students to sign in on that you can also document that you checked ID on, and that no examinee should be dismissed until all the materials are collected and accounted for. This is very important for security reasons. The new test has a lot of different mathematical tools that are used. If you're testing online, all of these tools are available as part of the online system. They will pop, the icon will pop up on the question that they can be used with. If you're testing paper-based, you're going to need the following. You'll need a basic 4-function calculator for the Level M Part 2 test. You'll need a scientific calculators for Levels D and A, Part 2 only. Calculators are never permitted on Levels L or E or in Part 1 of Levels M, D, and A, Mathematics, unless provided as an accommodation. If you are doing paper-based testing, you must provide the calculators for your examinees. Braille calculators or talking calculators may be used by examinees that require them. If you're doing the M, D, and the A level, you will need to provide a protractor. And if you're using the E level of the test, you'll need to provide a ruler. So all of these items are going to need to be provided with any paper-based training. I mentioned the TABE Administration Manual is available on the DRC Insight portal. It's your responsibility as a test coordinator or examiner to be familiar with this document. You should also be familiar with state policies and any procedures that your school or the state may have that are part of your role in the administration process. And remember that security must always be maintained and standardized test procedures must be followed throughout testing. Hey, I mentioned examinee ID. Data Recognition Corporation wants to make sure that we prevent impersonation and that we ensure examinee eligibility. So they want you to document against a current, valid, original government issue photo ID. Those acceptable IDs are a United States driver's license, a passport, a state identification card, a military ID, or a U.S. government or school approved ID. I want to take a minute and talk about school IDs. Our K-12 system, in order to give a student ID, requires documentation from that student's parents. That includes a birth certificate, a social security number or card, probably a resident proof of residency, all of those things. So if those are required to get the school approved ID, that's acceptable. If you base your student ID on the fact that the student tells you who they are and you do not require documentation of that, that ID cannot be used for testing purposes. Your test staff requirements. As a certified test administrator, you have to complete the requisite TABE 11 and 12 live or recorded training sessions. Right now we're only live, recorded will be coming soon. You need to complete the required state training. Currently we have the state training combined with the TABE training. Those will be separate once they go online and you will be required to complete both of those. The company requires that you have a high school diploma or its equivalent, but they prefer a bachelor's degree or higher, and they prefer a background in testing, assessment, or other educational practices. You must not be involved in any related preparatory course. So if you're teaching your students, you shouldn't be the person testing your students. Right here is an NRS, the level of scale scores for TABE 11 and 12 based upon the NRS levels. I want to take a moment to explain a little bit of difference with the new test. When TABE 9 and 10 was released, there was no national reporting system. So they adjusted TABE 9 and 10 to fit into the confines of the national reporting system. When they developed 11 and 12, the national reporting system was already in progress, was already established. So they developed the test levels around the NRS levels. So therefore, there are certain levels of the test that may be used at certain NRS levels. If we look at the chart in front of you, and I'm looking at the top one on reading, levels L and E can only be used, well, level L can only be used for NRS levels 1 and 2. Level E can only be used for NRS levels 1, 2, and 3. Level M for NRS levels 2, 3, and 4. Level D for NRS levels 3 and 4 and 5. And TABE A for levels 4, 5, and 6. Therefore, if you're looking at GED Prep, which is NRS levels 5 and 6, only the D and A test could be used for that purpose. If you look at some of the boxes, you'll see NAs. If we look on the low end at the NA, that means the score was out of range on the low end of the test, and no score will be provided. The scale score will have an NA, and the NRS level will have an OR for out of range. We'll talk a little bit more about out of range and what we have to do in just a couple more slides. If we're on the top end of the test and we score high, we won't be given an out of range score. What TABE 11 and 12 does is lock the test at the highest scale score acceptable by the NRS for that level of test and puts a plus sign beside it. So if I was taking the M level of the test, the highest score I could ever get on that test would be a 575 plus. I could not score 576, 577, or whatever. So the highest area I would be able to be placed in with that 575 plus would be NRS level 4. As I said before, in a couple more slides, when we get to out of range, I'll walk through the whole scenario with you. So if we look at the NRS level 5, that's GED Prep. So your next slide will show you that the minimum scale scores for reading would be 576, for mathematics would be 596, and for language would be 584. So they must reach those minimum scale scores, what we used to call the 9th grade, in order to be enrolled in your GED Prep classes. I mentioned that the Locator test is now a longer test. It's 51 questions, proposed time of 95 minutes. In order to obtain the most accurate test results, it's important that we give the level of test that best targets that examinee's skill level in each of the content areas. So you may see a scale score with reading being a D level and language being an M level, math being a D level. They could be all over the board based upon their skill level in each of the content. The best way to obtain this most accurate test result is to administer the Locator test. You want to view the Locator test as a starting point, but you may also want to consider other relevant information about the student. You can use your professional judgment. The Locator must be used for adult education before initial testing, the pre-test, in order to determine the level or levels of TABE to be assigned for your adult ed students. And like I said, it could indicate differences in the subject areas. If you're using this test to look for a certain level from the examinee, such as career source, career technical education, or employers, we are not requiring the use of the locator. However, I would like to caution that if you do not use the locator and the student scores out of range low, you will be given no score and will need to retest the student on a lower level of the test. So let's talk about these out of range scores. The test publisher has assured us that there will be a lot less out of range scores than we had in the past with the past test. I don't think there's any way to totally do away with out of range scores when you're looking at different levels of test. Every test that I've seen has some out of range areas. Like I said earlier, if you're looking at that chart a few slides back, the out of range scores will have a NA at the low level and a plus at the high level. I just brought this back up for you in a larger so that you can see this. So if I was to give the NRS, if I was to give level M of the test and the student scored below a 442, I would get an NA. And therefore I would have to go back and retest that student on level E of the test. If I was to give the M level of the test and the student scored got more than what they needed on that test, they would have a 575, the highest score acceptable, with a plus sign beside it. Let's look at the next slide. And this is a flow chart for initial placement. I have provided this in a larger handout for you that's available after the presentation is over. You'll be able to download it off of the IPDAY site. This is for initial placement. So on TABE 11 and 12, initial placement. Our policy is that all new students must be tested and obtain a reportable initial educational functioning level within the first 12 hours of instruction. So on initial test, we give the locator test and then the initial test. If that score is in range, hallelujah, you place that student based on the test and you go ahead and start instruction. You don't have anything else to do until 50, 60 hours down the road when you bring that student back in for post-testing. However, if we're out of range low on the initial test, I'm going to move to a larger slide. This is for, out of range low testing. So if I'm out of range low, I would turn around and I would retest on the lower form. I want to bring this chart back up again. If you'll notice, you cannot test out of range low on the L or the E level of the test. You can only score out of range low on the M, D, or A levels of the test. So if I test it out of range low, turn around and retest the second time. We're staying with our two-test out of range policy. We will not require the student to test more than twice. So we tested them on the initial test. They tested out of range low. So we retested them on a lower form. If that student was still out of range low, we would turn around and we would place that student in the lowest valid level of the lower TABE level test. So let's look at this. Whoops. Sorry about that. I tested out of range low on M. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go to D because I can't test out of range low on the E. So my first test was on D. I tested out of range low, so I went back and I retested the student on M. They tested out of range low again. I got an NA again. I would place that student in the lowest level of the lower of the two tests. So the lower of the two tests was M, and I would place them here in NRS level 2. If I retested them on the lower form and they tested out of range high, I would place the student based on the highest valid level of the lower test score, TABE test. So I initially tested them on M. They tested out of low, so I turned around and I tested them on E, and they got a 535 plus. They tested out of range high. I'd place them on the lower level of the lower test. I'm sorry, the highest level of the lower test. I'm sorry about that. So the highest level of E would be NRS level 3. E was the lower of the two tests. So the highest level of the lower test. If I retested them on the lower form and they were in range, then they go ahead and get placed in instruction and start instruction at that level. Now let's look at the fact that I was on the initial placement and they tested out of range high on the initial test. They had a plus sign. If I'm at levels L or E, I'd place the student in the highest valid level for that test. So if I tested them on L, I would place them in NRS level 2. If I tested them on E, because they'd have a 500 plus. If I tested them on E and they were out of range high, they'd have a 535 plus, and I'd put them in NRS level 3. If I'm at level M, you have your choice. I may retest them with a higher TABE level to see if they can go up into ASE GED prep, or I can place them in the highest valid level for M. So if I tested them on M and they tested out of range high, they'd have a 575 plus. So I can place them in NRS level 4, provide instruction, and 50, 60 hours down the road, post-test them and see if they're ready for NRS level 5 or 6, GED prep. Or if I have that 575 plus, I can go ahead and retest them on the D level of the test to see if they can score that 576 or higher. Just remember, because a student scored a 575 on M does not mean they'll score a 576 on D. You're moving into much more difficult material. If I'm at level D or A, I place them to the highest valid level for that TABE. So if I've got on the D, I had a 616 plus. On A, I can only get an 800. There's no 800 plus. I would place them in GED prep. So that is the initial placement. If I'm looking at the post-test, I have the same type of situation. If I post-test them and they are in range, I have two things I can do. If the post-test shows a change in educational functioning level and the student is still placed in the same program, being ABE, report that student as post-tested and report any literacy completion points in the next term and report the higher EFL. So if I had that student that post-tested in range, they were already in NRS level 3 on the M, they post-tested in range, they scored a 550, it moved them up to NRS level 4. They're still in ABE, but I would report that literacy completion point. If the test shows a change in EFL and the student's tested out of ABE, you would report the student as post-tested, report any LCPs, and exit the student from the appropriate course on the date the LCP was earned. So if we look at this, the student was in RS level 4, and they tested at a 576 or above to move up to NRS level 5. You would report the literacy completion point for NRS level 4, take them out of ABE, and enroll them in GED prep. Now, if it wasn't in range, the post-test was out of range, If it was out of range low, you do just what we've always been doing. You would report the student as post-tested with no LCPs earned. The EFL for the student remains the same as previously reported, and you continue instruction until the student is able to be post-tested. If they score out of range high with that plus sign, you still have the same option you had on the initial test. You would report the student as post-tested, and then you may retest them with a higher form to see if they can attain an in-range score of the higher level, or they may be reported with an EFL of the highest range on the TABE level test. LCPs awarded should only be based on the highest scale score provided for that TABE level test. So the example is the student has an initial functioning level in ABE level 2, reading. They post-test on TABE E and they score 535 plus. The student could be awarded the LCP for moving from level 2 to 3, but they can't move to level 4 without testing on the higher TABE level. So they were on level E, they scored a 535 plus, that only brings them to NRS level 3, will not move them to level 4 until you post-test them with an M level test and they can score that 536 or above. Okay, let's hope that answered all the post-testing and out-of-range questions. Talk a little bit about confidentiality. Remember that students are protected by FERPA, so score results are just as confidential as your examinee records, your test booklets, and your answer documents. They all need to be kept confidential. They all need to be kept in student permanent records or shredded when you're finished with using them. As far as unauthorized materials, as a test center, you're required to provide a safe place for examinees to store any materials that they bring. Any examinees that are found with prohibited items in the testing center will have their test subject to invalidation. The only thing that a student should really bring into the test center is their brain. You should be providing them with scrap paper, with pencils, and if needed, with calculators, protractors, or rulers if you're using the paper-based testing. These are prohibited items. Any electronic device, whether that be cell phone, pager, beeper, anything that is not being used as an accommodation for a student with a disability. Any device that might be used to scan, record, photograph, copy, or otherwise reproduce test content. Remember, there are handheld scanners that scan an entire page now. There shall be no books or papers of any kind brought into the testing room. No mechanical pens or highlighters or pens of any kind, only the pencil that you'll be providing the student with. Watches are prohibited, all watches. Smart watches, watches with alarms, flashing lights, watches have calculators, watches have internet capabilities, so all watches need to be left with the cell phone in the area that you're providing the student to leave their personal belongings. Headphones are not allowed unless they are as an accommodation. Purses, backpacks, food, drink, those are prohibited. Loose clothing, including hats, scarves, and jackets, unless as a medical or religious accommodation. And sunglasses, unless they are medically necessary, are all prohibited items. You need to be aware of testing irregularities that can occur and what you should do if those do occur. First thing we're going to talk about is an unplanned event or an emergency interruption. The main thing to remember is with any irregularity that can occur, safety first. The most important thing is your safety and the safety of your examinees. So if you have an unplanned event or an emergency interruption, try to remove your students from the testing center as safely as possible. If you have a system interruption, if you're testing online and the system goes down, whether it be because of power failure or internet failure, when the system comes back up, it will start back where it left off. If you have a disruptive examinee, an unauthorized visitor, an intruder, or disturbances of any kind that you cannot handle, you cannot get that examinee calmed down, or you can't get the people to leave, call for security. Just remember safety first. If your examinee or your examiner gets ill during testing, if the examinee has to leave the room, that test would have to be invalidated in that section of the test that they left the room in. The other sections of the test would be good. When the student is feeling better, they can come back and you give them the alternate version and they retake that section. If you as the examiner get ill, you should have a floating examiner that you can call to come take your place in a quick situation so that you may leave. If you have students that leave the testing room or take breaks during a timed session, that session of the test would be invalidated. They're not allowed to leave during a timed section of the test. If you have an examinee that questions the test content, let them know that you will notify the publisher. Please take notes on that, but ask them to answer it to the best of their ability. If you catch a student using unauthorized materials or cheating, copying, or otherwise reproducing the test content, that test needs to be invalidated for the entire test, and the student has to be treated as any other student that is caught cheating and has to deal with whatever your institution guidelines are for cheating. As for accommodations, they are the same on the paper-based test as they've been in the past. You have Braille, large print, and audio. If you're using Braille, there is automatic extra time allowed. If you're on the computer-based testing, as the administrator, you must turn on these two accommodations. Additional time, time and a quarter, time and a half, and untimed. And then there is text-to-speech functionality in English only. It will read the test to the student. When that is turned on, it becomes untimed. These accommodations are for students with visual impairments. If you have a student that cannot read and you need to give them the audio version or the text-to-speech version, please remember that you are no longer giving a reading comprehension test. You are now giving a listening comprehension test, and that should be considered when you're interpreting the results of the test. The publisher also says that testing for examinees that require accommodations need to be planned prior to the test time, because additional time, rooms, and our staff may be required. TABE 9 and 10 online has a lot of tools that are available for the student. The student would turn these tools on during testing. The only one of these that you must turn on as the administrator is the text-to-speech capability. All the other ones, there are icons on the test screen that allow them to do the line guide or the highlighter or whatever. It is very important that you offer the student the online tutorial so they know how to navigate their way through the online test and how to use the available tools. That online tutorial is found at tabetest.com. The tools that are available are a line guide. This line guide, you can click on it and it allows the student to move the line guide down line by line so that they can keep on track with their reading. The next tool is a highlighter. This allows the student to highlight a section of the test that they may feel is important for them to come back to at a later time. There's a cross-off capability. So if I'm looking at the answer and the distractors in the multiple choice, I can cross off the ones that I know are not the answer to the test and eliminate my possible answers. I have a magnifier. It allows me to zoom in at either 1.5 or double size. This could allow me to get a closer look at charts and graphs and the little legends that might accompany them. I have the option of adding sticky notes. I can add a sticky note and type in what I want to type in on that sticky note. So maybe if I want to type in my formula for my mathematics, or I want to type in a note about the reading, I can do that and leave that with the question. So if I come back at a later time, I can refer back to that note. The calculators are available either for function on level M or scientific on DNA. On the questions that they are able to use the calculator, it will light up on the top, the same for the protractor and the ruler. If you're giving it paper-based, you would provide the calculator for part 2 and they would use it on the sections they need. The next 3, the color choice, the contrasting color, and the reverse contrast, allow the student to change the color of the background of the font, to reverse the contrast of the font and background, whatever they need to be able to see the material better. The test gives me the ability to mask. I can mask out a section of the test that I don't need. There's an online large print. It will magnify to the size of the screen that you are using. I can mark questions for review. I can flag a question, come back to it after I'm done so I don't run out of time spending all my time on that question. I can also flag it if I wasn't sure about it and I just want to come back and review at the end. I have the ability to pause the test. If I pause the test, this does not stop the timer. What this does is it pauses the test so that the test will not time out on me. The test is set up so that if it is not used within 20 minutes, it will time out, thinking that nobody is using the computer. This will allow that timeout not to happen. There's a mathematics formula sheet that will appear when there's a formula that I need. If you're doing paper-based testing, the formula will be embedded within the question. And then there's a ruler for level E and a protractor for levels M, D, and A. Test security must be maintained at all times, both by the test publisher guidelines and by the state of Florida guidelines. The test publisher considers all formats of the printed test booklet to be secure. Also the test directions, the completed answer documents, the used scratch paper, and if you're doing computer-based, the test tickets. They say the manual's not secure, but it should be considered proprietary and confidential. So all of these materials should be locked up when they're not being used, and when you're done using them, they should be shredded. That is the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I have some resources here for you on the last couple of slides, our homepage, our frameworks, IPDAY, the Professional Development for Adult Learners, our technical assistance papers for both adult ed and career technical, and the scale score to grade equivalents. All this information's here on the slides. After this presentation's over, you can go to IPDAY and you'll be able to download the flowcharts in a larger picture, the NRS scores in a larger picture, and the PowerPoint is there for you also. I have a question here that says, will DRC have the ability to print group reports and the date of the test on the individual reports instead of the date printed. DRC has corrected that on TABE 11 and 12. You will get the date of the test, not the date the report was printed. Okay, at the top you'll have the date the report was printed, and with each of the tests you'll have the date they actually took the test. It has been corrected for 11 and 12. They're not going back for 9 and 10. As the ability to print group reports, I thought you could do that off of your reports, but I will add that to my questions for the test publisher and ask them when we get that information from them. Are there any other questions? If so, please print them. Put them into the question and answer box. Okay, I can print group reports without scores. Okay, so I want group report with scores. I will find out about that, and it will be part of our frequently asked questions. We have a list of frequently asked questions right now that will be posted on our website as soon as we get them all answered. I have about 5 more trainings on the books before we go to online training. I am going to try, and I didn't ask Joe about this, but I'm going to see if I can bring over, I can. I'm going to go out to Career and Adult Education. I just want to show you that if I go to Adult Education and I go to the Technical Assistance papers, right here with your Adult Ed Technical Assistance paper are your procedures for initial placement for Adult General and your procedures for post-testing, the flow charts that I showed you. So they're out here on the website. The other one, if I go to the Career and Technical website and I go to CTE Program Resources, I thought I could get there. There we go. And I go to the PSAV resources. There's your TABE scale scores to grade level matrix. So those are both available out on our website. My next question, I may have missed this, but is post-testing after suggested instruction? Yes, it's still the same, 50 to 60 hours in between tests with a minimum of 40. If the student, on the out of range chart, if a student was placed in level 4 from the pre-test on a D-level test and then post-test high plus, can we claim the LCP from 4 to 5? Let me bring up that chart, Milla, I'm sorry. So I was placed in level 4 using the D-level test, and then I post-test it with a 656 plus, the highest I could get on D. Yes, you moved from NRS level 4 into GED prep. So you would learn that, the student would earn that literacy completion. How often must TABE examiners be trained? We're sticking with our 2-year refresher. We will have that online. You'll just be able to go out online and either do the one we have on IP Day or the one that DRC has on theirs. You'll print a certificate out either way, and you'll have that for your purposes. The last question is that for 9, 10, or 11, and 12. Are we talking the post-test high? There is no plus sign on 9, 10. There is out of range scores on 9, 10, and if you have an out of range score on 9, 10, you may not claim the literacy completion point. That did not change. The difference in 11 and 12 is they are not allowing for out of range scores. They lock it at the highest score possible. So hopefully that answered that question. If not, bring it back up again. Let's see. Yes. So the last question, like I said, 9, 10, you would have to retest them if you were out of range. 11 and 12, if you have the plus sign, that's a valid score. Any other questions? As you know, you're free to email me, jane.silveria@fldoe.org, anytime you have questions, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If it's a question I have to send to the test publisher, it will be part of our frequently asked questions that I hope to get posted out here sometime next month. By the time we get them all answered, I think I'm down to about another 10 I just submitted to them yesterday. So if there's no more open questions, I am going to end this webinar, and I thank you for attending. Oops, does this live webinar count for the refresher? No, it does not. This was just an update. There's no certificates issued with this. You're welcome, Trevor. Okay, anything else? Thank you very much.